When Japan surrendered in 1945, the world finally took a breath. The war was over, or so everyone thought. But deep in a jungle thousands of miles away, one man refused to believe it. Hidden among the trees of a remote Philippine island, a Japanese soldier was still fighting a war that had ended decades earlier. For nearly 30 years, he lived as if time had stopped, convinced his country still needed him. His name was Hiroo Onoda, and his story remains one of the most astonishing tales of loyalty, isolation, and human endurance ever told. Hiroo Onoda was born in 1922 in Wakayama Prefecture, Japan, into a world where honor and duty were everything. His family expected him to serve his country with absolute devotion, and from a young age, he absorbed the code of loyalty that defined Imperial Japan. When the Second World War broke out, he joined the Imperial Japanese Army and was soon recognized for his intelligence and discipline. He trained at the Nakano School, Japan's elite military intelligence and guerrilla warfare academy. This wasn't a place for ordinary soldiers. It was where Japan prepared its most skilled operatives for unconventional missions behind enemy lines. There, Onoda learned sabotage, survival, deception, and how to live off the land. More importantly, he was taught a core belief that would later define his life: never surrender. The mission comes before everything, even life itself. By 1944, Japan was losing ground across the Pacific. The Philippines had become a key battlefield, and the situation was desperate. Onoda was ordered to the small island of Lubang, southwest of Manila. His mission: sabotage the enemy, destroy the airstrip and pier, and continue resistance by any means necessary. His superiors told him something that would echo in his mind for the next 3 decades. Under no circumstances are you to surrender or take your own life. He was to keep fighting until formally relieved of duty. When Onoda and a small group of men arrived on Lubang in late 1944, the war was already turning against Japan. The island's defenders were disorganized and unprepared. American and Filipino forces invaded in early 1945, overwhelming the Japanese garrison. Many soldiers were killed, captured, or surrendered. But Onoda and 3 others refused to give up. They escaped into the island's thick jungle, carrying rifles, grenades, and a single belief: that the war must still be raging somewhere and that Japan's victory was only a matter of time. From that moment on, Hiroo Onoda disappeared from the world. The 4 men lived as ghosts in the forest. They built hidden shelters, hunted for food, and stole rice and livestock from nearby farms. To them, every civilian was a potential enemy, and every sound in the jungle could be an ambush. For months, they waited for the Japanese army to return, but instead of reinforcements, leaflets began to appear. They fluttered down from the sky, dropped by Allied planes. "The war has ended," the leaflet said. "Japan has surrendered. Return home." But Onoda and his men refused to believe it. They thought it was enemy propaganda meant to lure them out. Even when they found newspapers and letters with familiar handwriting, they assumed they were fakes. Over time, the islanders began to fear them. Sporadic gunfire echoed from the jungle, and villagers reported being attacked or robbed. Decades later, historians estimated that Japanese holdouts across the Philippines were responsible for dozens of deaths, and Onoda's group was among those involved. What began as a military mission had turned into a long, tragic shadow of the war. Years passed. The men stayed hidden, moving camps to avoid capture. In 1949, one of them surrendered, convinced the war was really over. The others called him a traitor. Another was killed in a skirmish with local search parties, and by the early 1950s, Onoda was left with only one companion, a soldier named Kozuka. The two became inseparable, living by strict military routine. Every morning, they polished their weapons, planned patrols, and recorded intelligence on imaginary enemy activity. They survived on wild fruit, coconuts, and stolen livestock. When villagers tried to tell them Japan had lost the war, they ignored it. To Onoda, the world outside was a battlefield, and surrender meant disgrace. In 1972, nearly 30 years after the war ended, Kozuka was shot and killed by local police during a raid. For Onoda, that moment changed everything. He was alone now, the last soldier still fighting a war that no longer existed. Imagine waking up every day surrounded by silence, believing that your country still depends on you. That was Onoda's life for years. He kept his uniform clean, his rifle ready, and his mind sharp. He built small fires only on cloudy nights, so the smoke couldn't be seen. He avoided paths, moved silently, and studied the habits of the villagers like an invisible observer. Decades went by. Planes flew overhead, and radios crackled in the distance. But he stayed hidden. He thought Japan had fallen to the Americans completely, and that his homeland was now under occupation. The world around him had changed completely. Man had walked on the moon, television had become global, and Japan had rebuilt itself into a modern nation. But Onoda was frozen in 1945. Search parties were sent multiple times, some even dropping letters from his family. One included a message from his brother, begging him to come home. He still refused to believe it. The enemy knows my brother's handwriting, he thought. They've forged it. Then came 1974, the year everything changed. A young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki had set off on a strange quest. He told friends he wanted to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. Most people laughed, but Suzuki meant it. He arrived on Lubang Island and began exploring the jungle, asking locals where the mysterious soldier might be. Against all odds, he found him. Then the two men met. Onoda emerged from the trees in a tattered uniform, his rifle still in hand. Suzuki spoke Japanese, bowing and introducing himself. For the first time in nearly 30 years, Onoda met another countryman face to face. They talked for hours. Suzuki told him Japan had surrendered, that the war had ended long ago. But Onoda refused to surrender without direct orders from his commanding officer. It was the rule he had lived by his entire adult life. Suzuki returned to Japan with photographs and proof that Onoda was still alive. The story made headlines around the world. The Japanese government tracked down Onoda's former commander, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who was now living a quiet civilian life. When officials told him the news, he was stunned. Nearly 3 decades had passed since he'd given that final order on Lubang. Yet his words had kept one man fighting all that time. In March 1974, Taniguchi traveled to the Philippines. When he met Onoda in the jungle, the old soldier saluted. Taniguchi, wearing his civilian clothes, read the official order relieving him of duty. For the first time, Onoda accepted that the war was over. He returned to camp and cleaned his rifle one last time. The next day, dressed in his full uniform, he walked out of the jungle and surrendered to Philippine authorities. He handed over his Arasaka Type 99 rifle, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and the dagger his mother had given him in 1944, meant for suicide if captured. He never used it. The world watched in awe. He was gaunt but calm, still disciplined, still saluting with precision. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos granted him a full pardon for the actions committed during his years in hiding, recognizing that he had believed he was following wartime orders. After 29 years in the jungle, Hiroo Onoda's war was finally over. When Onoda arrived in Tokyo, crowds and reporters swarmed him. To some, he was a hero, a man of unshakable loyalty who had fulfilled his duty beyond imagination. To others, he was a tragic symbol of the blind obedience that had led Japan into war. He struggled to adjust to modern life. Japan was now an entirely different country, peaceful, industrialized, and far removed from the empire he had once served. Onoda published his memoir, No Surrender, My 30-Year War, where he described his experiences in detail. The book became a global phenomenon, yet he wasn't comfortable in the spotlight. Seeking peace, he moved to Brazil, where he lived as a rancher for many years. Later, he returned to Japan and established a youth nature school to teach discipline, survival skills, and respect for nature. Even in his later years, he continued to live by the code that had guided him in the jungle: endurance, loyalty, and purpose. Hiroo Onoda's story captured the world's imagination, but it also raised difficult questions. His actions had cost lives. Filipino villagers who had nothing to do with the war were caught in the crossfire of his mistaken mission. For some, he was a tragic figure rather than a hero, a man whose sense of duty blinded him to reality. For others, he was a living symbol of faith and perseverance. He wasn't the last Japanese soldier found after the war, but he was the most famous. Later that same year, another holdout named Teruo Nakamura was discovered in Indonesia, but Onoda's story had already become legend. When Hiroo Onoda passed away in 2014 at the age of 91, Japan mourned and reflected. His life represented something complex: the strength of belief, the tragedy of isolation, and the line between loyalty and delusion. Hiroo Onoda's 30-Year War was more than just a survival story. It was a mirror reflecting how powerful belief can be, how one man's unwavering sense of duty could keep him trapped in a world that no longer existed. For decades, he fought for an empire that had long been gone, bound by words spoken in 1944.